bit of backstory. Me and my best friend, roommate, are in the army. One night we had gotten off work pretty late and decided to do a Waffle House run. It was around 11:30-12. He's very religious, my friend, not in the sense that he goes to church every Sunday, but in the sense that he's a real believer. He's had a lot of haunted and weird coincidental events during his life, and he is like a magnet for weird spiritual events like the one I'm about to tell you now. I'm an atheist, or at least that's what I thought. I guess I'm agnostic now. I didn't believe before, as I'd had no experiences of my own, and unless I'm in close proximity of my friend, I don't experience anything. On the drive over to the Waffle House, my buddy was having a crisis of faith and was telling me how he doesn't seem to have faith in the way he used to, and he's not sure anymore if it's all real. I tell him that maybe he's just in a funk and being in the army is getting to him. We arrive at the restaurant, dismiss the conversation and get some breakfast. It's only us in there, along with the Waffle House crew and an old couple. We sit down and order, and that's when things got weird. By looking at us, we're not approachable. People just don't talk to us. Apparently I always look angry, and my buddy is muscular and intimidating. Nobody ever goes out of their way to talk to me or my friends, but for some weird reason, this couple was doing their damnedest to initiate conversation with us. So finally we submit and start bullshitting with them. We started asking them questions in a casual manner, but mainly because we didn't trust them. I got up and walked over to the jukebox to put on some music. Rolling Stones, Sympathy for the Devil. I did this mainly for the music, but also so I could get a better look at them. I noticed that the guy is about 50 at the oldest, and she is about the same. We found out he was a young lieutenant in Vietnam. I asked him if he liked the Stones, and he says, "Yeah, they're my favourite band." We talk about his time in Nam, but also to see what does and doesn't check out with this guy, because dudes like to fake that they were in the military. Then he asked me who was singing the song that was currently on, and what the song was. 2 red flags are showing right now. 1, I'm not buying the young lieutenant in Vietnam story because nothing he said makes sense, and his age didn't check out. The army jargon didn't check out, I guess is what I'm saying. So I instantly think he is lying to us in order to connect with us, like, hey, I was in the army too. Second red flag was if this guy was in Vietnam. If this guy's favourite band is the Rolling Stones, he should definitely know and recognise Sympathy for the Devil. It is quintessential Vietnam-era music, and a Rolling Stones classic, so instantly my buddy and I peg this couple as bullshit and begin assuming that they have an angle. Why would an older couple be out at midnight at Waffle House? Why are they trying to initiate conversation with us, and why are they lying? My buddy and I get up to leave, and they ask us to stay. We keep moving as we leave. The old guy grabs my arm and says, "I used to think God was a joke too." I sort of chuckled out of surprise because I thought he was joking, but then I realised that he's not looking at me, he's looking at my friend. He goes on, "I used to think God was a joke too, until I realised the truth." He then let me go and we got out of there. It was only on the way home that my roommate put all the points together and he was like, "Bro, I think those guys were angels. You remember how I was telling you I was having a crisis of faith? What are the chances we meet those 2 weirdos doing their best impression of humans and desperately trying to engage us in conversation, and then that shit he said to me before we left? Those were fucking angels, bro." And honestly, I believe him. This happened when I was 18 and I'm now 20. I was a senior in high school. This incident happened over 2 years ago, and at the time I drove a 1988 Ford Mustang Fox body that I drove to and from school every day, which was about 4.5 miles or so. One day I'm doing my regular drive to school, and I see a blue Altima behind me. I obviously think nothing of it, given it's the first time seeing it. Usually I would stop at the 7-Eleven for a hot dog and a coffee of some sort. The Altima followed me into the forecourt, and before I could even get out of my car, the driver of the Altima was waiting for me to get out. He started asking me what work I've had done to my car at the time, so I explain all the mods. He seemed friendly at first, asking all the normal questions that you would ask when you see a car like that, but then he started asking me personal questions like, how much did you pay for it? Where did you buy it? And can I see the title? I didn't know how to respond with the title question, so I told him I'd left it at home. He said okay and hopped back in his car. I noticed he hadn't left yet though. I go into the 7-Eleven, grab a coffee, and I was on my way out. When I tried to start the car, it was hesitant to start. I tried again and it was still hesitant, but eventually it started. I'm pulling out of the car park when I look behind me and noticed the blue Altima was backing out of his parking spot as soon as I'd made a right turn onto the road. I thought it was kind of weird, but maybe he was going the same way, or just wanted to see the car some more. I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, which is kind of a spread out area, so he could be going anywhere. On my way to school, I have about 7 or 8 turns that I have to make along the way. On the 4th turn, I saw the blue Altima still following me, although he was a few cars back, so at this point I'm starting to get a little freaked out. I have a 5-inch stiletto in my door pocket, so I'm not too scared, but still creeped out nonetheless, because a middle-aged man was following me. I parked in my usual parking spot and went into school. As I was walking in, I looked back and the Altima had followed the cul-de-sac and slowly passed by where I had parked. My friends wanted to stay after for the football game, so I joined them and we had a good time. After it was over around 7:30, we all headed our separate ways. The sun was already below the horizon and I hop into my car. When I tried to start it, it only cranks but no fire. I'm kind of pissed at this point because I just wanted to get home and relax. I pop the hood and I don't see anything visibly wrong. I get back in to check if it was a fuel problem, so I turn the key to the run position to see if the fuel pump worked. Nothing. I was thinking about calling a tow at this point because it was getting dark and I was in a high school parking lot. I'm tired and with no tools. I called my dad to see if he could help me over the phone with anything, but he just said to me, "You're fucked," and we both laughed. I'm now in the middle of trying to find a tow service and I can hear road noise coming from up the street. I then start to notice a pair of headlights. What is someone doing driving in a cul-de-sac of a high school at this time of night? My heart seemed to fall out of my chest and onto the floor as I see the headlights of a dark blue Altima. It pulls into the parking lot and parks 3 spaces away from me. I try to discreetly walk to my car door and grab my stiletto out of the door pocket. I get it as he gets out of the car, almost in a hurry, and asks me if I need any help. "No, I got a tow truck on the way," I lied, trying to get him the hell out of here, but unfortunately he didn't leave. Then, almost like he was acting out a line for a cheesy TV commercial, he says, "Hey, I remember you. You were at the 7-Eleven this morning." I awkwardly chuckled and said, "Oh yeah, I remember you." He asked me if I needed a ride in his car, and I politely declined. He kept on insisting I get into his car so he can take me home. He started getting a little closer to me while still asking. I'm now fed up with this guy's bullshit, and I tell him to back off because he is about 4 feet away from me, too close for my liking. He stopped and looked at me with a face of disappointment, and it quickly turned to anger. He started walking back to his car when he stopped and looked back. 3412 Alhambra Road. My brain took a second to process what this man had just said. How the fuck did he know where I lived? I pulled out my blade and it made a really dramatic eject noise. I asked, "What does that address mean?" He says, "Oh what, you're gonna stab me?" I was an 18-year-old who grew up in the suburbs and had only gotten into 2 fights in my entire lifetime of school. I really didn't feel like stabbing someone and having to live with it for the rest of my life. "You're being creepy as fuck," I said. I ran the other way as fast as I could, and the man just stayed where he was. I went to hide behind the portable classrooms and wait. I heard the start-up of the Altima, so I poked my head out to look. He's reversing out of his parking spot and slowly leaving the parking lot and following my last seen location. I stay ducked behind the bushes next to the portables as he stops and rolls down his window. "If I ever see you again, I'm going to kill you," he yells from his car. I call my dad while still in the bushes and tell him what had just happened. The first thing he asked was, "Did you get his license plate?" I wanted to slam my head on the wall. I never thought to get his plate. He came and picked me up and we got a tow the next day. My mum was hysterical when I told her about the whole address thing. She told my dad we have to get the fuck out of here at dinner the next night. My dad and I rented a U-Haul and packed all of our shit up from our 2-bedroom apartment. We moved to where I'm currently living, San Jose, California, and we haven't seen him since. There's no update on the police report, no stalker and no blue Ultima. I really hope that creepy fuck gets put behind bars. Anyway, this is my first time posting something like this on Reddit, so whoever is reading this, I hope you have a good one, and thanks for taking the time to look at my post. So for the last 15 or so years of my life, I've been dreaming about a man who is constantly following me. I thought he was just a figment of my imagination, but then today happened. I know from the title of this story it sounds like the beginning of a love story, but I assure you, it is quite the opposite. In my dreams, this man always looks the same, but I don't know who he is. He follows me in every dream, all of them. I could be dreaming about school, and he'd be lurking by the window. Or I could be dreaming I'm flying, and he'd be in a hot air balloon. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, he is always watching. However, I will randomly have the same dream. It's not every night. In fact, I only experience it once or twice a year, but when I am experiencing it, I have no memory of it previously occurring. It is like I'm experiencing it all for the first time. Now the dream. I'm trapped in a glass house. Everything in it is glass. The walls, ceilings, doors, floors, furniture, everything. Outside I can see about a mile of freshly cut grass, and there are trees surrounding everything. I look for an exit, but since everything is transparent, I notice very quickly that there is no exit. Upon realizing I'm trapped, I begin kicking the exterior walls, but they don't even crack. I begin throwing anything and everything I can find at the walls, but the only things that break are the thrown items. I panic. Then I hear someone moving around above me. I look up and notice the man, who is covered head to toe in black clothing, as always, and he is trying to open a door. I don't know it for sure, but I can feel that he is after me this time. Suddenly there is a flash of light, and I notice a large knife in the man's hand was reflecting the light. He is going to kill me with that knife. I don't know how, but I know that that is his intention. My mind is reeling at this point, and I know I have to escape, but I cannot think how. I begin throwing things again, and I become hysterical. Somewhere in between my sobs, I hear the pathetic little sound of a small child's voice calling, "Sissa?" I look over to the opposite exterior wall, and I see my little sister crying and clutching onto the bunny she carried everywhere for the first 4 years of her life. She is exactly as she was when she was 4, but I am my current age. My protective instinct forces me to go to her. Everything in my being needs to keep her safe. I run over to her and our hands meet together, with the glass being the only thing separating us. "Sissa, I'm scared. Help me, Sissa." She is now crying after noticing how visibly upset I am. "I'm trying, baby girl, I'm trying," I say between sobs. I'm patting the glass beside us, still trying to find a weak spot, but to no avail. We sit there crying together. She is young, but I can tell she understands the situation. We stare at each other knowingly for a moment. Suddenly I hear the doorknob turn and creaks as it slowly opens. The man straightens up and takes a step forward. He is wearing a mask, but I can tell he is smiling. I stand up, not ready, but forcing myself to face what is about to happen. Then I wake up, every single time. As I stated before, this man has haunted my dreams for the last 15 years, and normally I would ignore it like I always have, but I saw him today. I actually saw him. He was here in the real world with me, and not a character in my dreams. He wasn't wearing his mask, but everything about him was the same. He greeted me in passing, but I'd become stone cold with fear, and I stared awkwardly as he passed. I know it sounds crazy, but it was him. I'm sure of it. I'm so terrified right now. I'm afraid to go to sleep, and I'm afraid my dreams will come to fruition. I'm just hoping that I'm wrong. Hi, I'm Rose. I'm 21 years old and I'm posting this story to share my experiences. All of these stories are true and I will be splitting them up into multiple sub-stories. That being said, enjoy. My odd childhood. When I was younger, I looked exactly like the little girl from the original Poltergeist movie. I was always followed by a tall, black, shadow man figure with glowing red eyes, although I don't remember when exactly he stopped following me, and he never got too close from what I remember. My mum said I'd always go and sit at the back porch and talk to something she couldn't see. I'd put my hands on the glass, pausing between turns and having a seemingly normal conversation with mid-air. When I was in elementary school, I remember coming home one day, going up to my room to do homework, and all of a sudden the trash can that was keeping my door open flew out of the way and my door flew shut. I was so petrified I threw my homework down and hid under the covers for a good 5 to 10 minutes. The boogeyman and entities that live in my house. I'm now 21 years old and live in Florida. I'm from Virginia, however, and that's exactly where my childhood hauntings started. I've never gotten along with my parents, as my mum is a very mean-spirited woman, and my dad hadn't been there much and is no better than my mum. My grandfather is really the person who basically raised me, and I've always thought of him as my dad. I can't recall too much from my childhood, but I do remember when I was anywhere from 4 to 8 years old that my parents divorced. I remember always being afraid of that house growing up, even to this day. I never wanted to be left home alone, especially in a storm. As I got older, if I was ever home alone, I'd always turn on some sort of background noise and a bunch of lights in the house to ease my mind a little. The most common occurrences were always footsteps running up the stairs when everyone was in another room or asleep, something calling my name when no one had been, doors opening, cold drafts, the curtains always moving when there was no air flowing, and what we call the boogeyman. It was me, my mum, younger brother and grandpa in that house. My grandpa and I both had rooms on the 3rd floor, and my mum's and brother's rooms were on the 1st floor. Their room used to be the storage room, and no one ever wanted to go in there because we believed something was living in there. My grandpa's room was the room we dreaded the most in the house. We would only ever hear things when he wasn't home, and he didn't believe in ghosts, or that there was anything in his room. His room is where one of his relatives had slipped and broken his neck on the dresser and had passed away years and years ago. Any time my grandfather wasn't home was when we would hear the same things every day. Something would be walking around in his room, then would go in the bathroom and flush the toilet. Then it would turn the sink on and back off after about 5 to 10 seconds. Then we would continue to hear footsteps in the room. We had a joke going and called it the clean ghost. We had never been sure if this entity was the same thing causing the other things that occurred on a regular basis, as we believed there to be multiple entities present in the home. To be clear, we had no animals, and all of these occurrences were odd to me, even though I'm not a very religious person, as the house was blessed once before, and there is oddly enough a mark or stain of some sort on the back porch window, which resembles an angel kneeling with its head down. At least that's what it seems to be. For the most part, we only experienced those few things, but there were often times I'd feel scared and on edge. Most of the time when I would go upstairs to go to bed, I would hear footsteps following me, so I'd run to my room, close and lock the door, and turn all of my lights on. Or for instance, I'd be in the bathroom taking a shower or bath, and I'd hear someone pacing around the door outside, just to find no one there when I went to look. Everyone would be downstairs or somewhere else in the house. This thing would bother my mum more often than me, though. My mum would always tell me something would rattle her bedroom doorknob and knock on her door, calling her name. I'd sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to hear something walking up the stairs that would stop in front of my door when everyone was asleep. I'd be too scared to open my door to go to the bathroom, even though it was only right across the hall. The other more demonic type of occurrence worth mentioning would be when my mum had a friend over late one night. It was about 12 to 4 a.m. She was outside walking her friend to the car, and before I went outside to ask my mum something, she came running inside as fast as she could and told me and my brother to go turn the lights in her room off, lock the door, and duck and cover out of view from her window. I kept asking her why, but she wouldn't answer. Out of curiosity, I peeked out of the window and had gotten my answer. There, looking back at all of us from within my mum's window, which was at least a good 5 feet off the ground, was a pair of glowing red eyes. They had such an evil feeling to them. As soon as the eyes were gone, I asked my mum what the hell it was and why it was there. I can't recall her answer, but I'll always remember that moment and the fear we felt. Overall, living in that house was no fun, and we would always feel scared, as things like this would always happen. I lived in that house until I was 18, at which point I moved out. Tennessee Horror House. One summer break in between my first or second year of middle school, I had to go live with my mum, brother, aunt and my grandma in Tennessee because my grandfather was too busy with work and my mum didn't think I was responsible enough to stay home alone there. We lived there for about 1.5 to 2 years, and those were the worst years of my life. I remember starting whatever year of middle school it was and how much I hated my new school and not knowing anyone. However, I loved how interested everyone was with my accent and how they were super interested I was from Virginia, for whatever reason. A lot of people talked to me and I thought I had made new friends. I'd made one, but I was very wrong in thinking the other girls were my friends too. They acted nice towards me at school. Then one day they'd somehow figured out my address and just showed up at our door, knocking and asking for me to come out with them so they can show me around town. My mum called me to the door, and I thought it was a little strange that they'd found our house. Nevertheless, I was excited about having friends and exploring with them. So we started our walk and we came across somewhere I was unfamiliar with, and we all stopped in front of what I now know as one of the girls' houses. They then all started being really mean and were threatening me. They said harsh things like, "We aren't really your friends," and were threatening me, saying if I ever stepped on their property, they would shoot me, and that I was so ugly they could easily hide my body and get away with it. They continued to be complete bitches. I was now really scared because I was in a new place and I didn't know my way home. I'm not at all sure how I got home, but I did, and I remember telling everyone how cruel those girls had been to me and all the things they had said to me. My mum took it up with the principal, and the girls were expelled from school and their mums were called. I was scared to go to school the next few days, and I still hated the school overall. I made at least 1 or 2 actual friends and had them to sit with at lunch and talk to. I don't recall too much from living there. The house we were living in was creepy as hell. It was a house on a hill, a typical horror movie house. I always felt so drained and absolutely paralysed with fear the whole duration of time we lived there. I slept in my aunt's room often, as I don't believe I had my own room with the house being so tiny. I'd sleep in there when she was working nights or if she wasn't there. Her room was definitely the spirit hotspot of the house. From the things I recall of my time living in that house, I'd never feel safe with the lights off anywhere, but specifically in my aunt's room. I'd never have an easy time falling asleep. I'd have constant violent nightmares and would always get sleep paralysis and see shadows, or I'd wake up to something calling my name out in a deep voice. I always felt like I was being watched and as if something wanted to hurt me. I'd wake up often to something really cold touching me or grabbing me and scaring me awake. I always had my aunt's dog sleep with me. He was a big pit bull, and he'd lay on top of me and protect me when I slept in there. It was almost every night I'd wake up hearing him growl or bark viciously at something, with all of his hair on end and his ears folded back. He'd always stare directly at the bathroom and growl at something I didn't always see. He had a super deep bark and growl, and it would often scare me to wake up to, but not nearly as much as when I'd seen the figure. I saw it a few times. It was a big, jet-black figure who stood almost to the ceiling of the room, and its eyes had a reddish-yellow glow to them. After encountering these things on a daily, nightly occurrence, or at least 2 to 4 times a week, it got to the point where I was losing sleep because I was too petrified with all the things that were going on, especially after my aunt's dog had run away and there was no one to protect me anymore. We eventually moved out of that house, finally. I remember the last trip my aunt and I had made to get the last of our things. There was a thunderstorm, and as we loaded up the last things into the truck and started up the car ready to take off down the hill, I took one last look at that creepy house, and at that exact moment I saw a huge flash of lightning hit where what looked like was the right part of the house, and in the window of one of the rooms. I saw a dark, shadowy figure of someone staring back at me. My heart was racing as we drove away, and I was more than relieved to be leaving. The porcelain presence. I was still living in my grandpa's house with my mum and brother when this next incident took place. This was before I ever moved to Tennessee. We were at the thrift store down the road from our house, and one certain item caught my eye over everything else in the store. It was a gorgeous porcelain doll with pale skin, brown eyes, long dark brown locked hair, and was dressed in a Victorian-styled salmon pink outfit, and she had a little umbrella in her right hand. I noticed her as soon as I walked in, and I ended up going home with her. I can't tell you why I was so drawn to her, as my aunt has a good 6 to 12 porcelain dolls of her own in her living room, and I never liked to see them any time we went over to visit. But I was drawn to this doll for some reason. I'd always talk to her as if she were my child, play with her hair, take her everywhere with me, show her to my family all the time, etc. My mum and brother thought the doll was really creepy and often told me so. I got offended when they said such things, and I responded by saying, "Don't say that, she doesn't like it." Things went on like that for about a week or so after buying her, and things changed pretty quickly one day, when after coming home from school every day, I'd noticed that when going up to my room, the doll had moved from where I had left her before leaving. She'd even gotten into different positions somehow. I know no one was going into my room when I was gone, as my mum always stayed in her room, my brother got home after I did, and my grandfather was at work until 5 or 6. This happened every day. My mum started telling me that something or someone was walking around in my room during the day when I was gone, and it was happening often. Things continued like this, and I started interacting with the doll a lot less, putting her up out of the way and hiding her as I was becoming afraid of her. I started having nightmares about the doll killing me, and when I woke up or went to get her, I always felt like she had her eyes on me. Whenever I had my friends over, I always asked them to stay with me. Well, pleaded really. I'd want them to sleep over because I was so afraid of the house already, and was now becoming afraid of this doll. One time my friend agreed, and we decided to go into the closet and sit right in front of the storage room where I had started locking her away. We'd play with a Ouija board to see if we could find anything out about this doll. The whole time we played, we heard things in the storage room where the doll was, and even saw shadows outside of the closet looking at us. We played with it for a good hour or more, and we were getting answers telling us that there were over 10 entities in the room, and other words like hurt or die, and you are being watched. We said goodbye to the board and decided to place a recorder in the room and leave it on whilst we went and got some food and had a shower. When we came back, we heard all sorts of voices, whispers, and footsteps coming from the closet area. We set the recorder for another session, overnight this time. When we woke up in the morning, curious to find out what we had captured, we heard all the things from before, only this time it was intensified. We heard multiple voices, a demonic growl, strange noises that almost sounded animalish, and the most shocking of all, at the end of the recording we heard what sounded like a huge stack of fine china being thrown hard and smashed to bits in the room the doll was in. Within the same week I wrote a warning note for the doll, grabbed her and had my friend take me up to the thrift store I got her from. We walked in and I dropped the doll in the donation bin along with the note reading, "Warning, this doll is very haunted. Please get rid of her and do not resell." And we walked out of the door. I am writing an English major in college with an emphasis in creative writing. We are permitted to write fictional short stories, creative non-fiction, and poetry. It was Halloween and I decided to write a creative non-fiction piece about my first scary paranormal experience. I get to now share this with you via the magic of copy and paste. As a child, I had a considerable amount of phobias. I feared snakes, heights, spiders, centipedes, roller coasters, the mask section at Walmart during Halloween time, and the dark. Other than snakes, the dark was the fear that persisted the longest. I remember the first time I truly felt a fear of monsters in the dark. It was 2004 and I was 6 years old. My family was walking out of a movie and I saw one of the large ad posters that hung on the wall. It was for Seed of Chucky, which if you weren't aware is from the Child's Play series. This poster in particular showcased a mangled Chucky with large slices that had been stitched up, standing with his doll wife over a bassinet. A baby's arm could be seen reaching upward towards the two, holding a very gothic-looking baby rattle. At the time, the only thing that really drew my attention was the face of Chucky. I imagined him coming into my room to kill me or kidnap me. I was worried I would see his sinister, smiling face when I looked through my bedroom window at night. From that point on, and for a period of about 2 years, I refused to sleep in my room. I insisted on sleeping in my parents' bed, sheltered between them for my own safety. As I'm sure any parents would, mine got tired of this routine. Sleeping in their bed was no longer an option, but neither was sleeping in mine. Enter the bravery bed. This ironically named twin mattress was placed on the floor next to their bed. I was to come from my own room to this thin mattress from now on if I felt scared, so as to not disturb my parents. Sleeping on the floor did not feel as secure as sleeping on an elevated king mattress, snuggled between the two people you think will protect you the most from your childhood monsters. I didn't know that neither my mother nor my father would be awake to see my monster. I was almost 7 years old, and on this particular night, I vehemently refused to sleep on my bed or the bravery bed, being as terrified of the dark as I was. My parents knew to leave their bedroom door open with the hallway light on, so I could see my surroundings and know nothing was lurking. I woke up and nothing felt odd at first. I had simply awoken from a dream, and there was nothing wrong. But slowly I felt a sense of unease rise within me. It is like the feeling you get when you know you're going to shiver. Like eyes were on the back of my neck, and they weren't my mum's or my dad's. I felt myself sit up in bed almost involuntarily, and my gaze was glued in the direction of the open door and out into the hallway. This build-up of anxious energy kept increasing, and it was pure entropy, like anything could happen in the next moment. The next thing I felt was a wave of dread wash over me. It was the first time I had experienced an emotion like that, so it was all the more unnerving. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't speak, and I couldn't remove my eyes from the lit hallway, no matter how hard I tried. The dread kept intensifying, and I would have cried from fear had it been possible in that moment. It was then that I finally saw the source of my terror. It hobbled out from my room and into the hallway. It was hunched over at a severe angle, and I could see the shape of its spine clearly. It was crouched with its thin legs, and I saw that its feet were much too long to be a human's. Its arms were bent, forearms jutting forward, and the hands were long and bony. I imagined that this creature must have clawed, shrugged, and crawled its way out of the deepest and darkest pit in hell to come into my house. While I could not breathe, if there was any air left in my lungs, it was sucked out in that moment. I was paralyzed, whether of my own physical malfunction or by the will of this dark goblin, I don't know. The most unsettling feature of the monster was that no light made contact with its skin. I was staring at pure shadow, black as the void. It continued to hobble down the hallway and disappeared into a wall. Once it was out of sight, my small frame collapsed backwards into the mattress and I was asleep again. Having been a child with a vast imagination, even I didn't doubt that this was a nightmare. The next morning I was a little spooked, but I continued into my day otherwise unaffected. The thought of the silhouette did not cross my mind again, that is, until the nightmare resumed into my waking hours. I was walking down the same hallway out into the dining room and towards the garage door, where I expected my mother to arrive at any moment. I had just made it past the dining table and was about a dozen feet from the garage door when my body froze and I felt the dread wash over me a second time. I couldn't move, speak, or scream for help. My eyes were fixed straight ahead of me, and I could only sit and wait for whatever was coming. To my horror, the same evil shadow I had seen the night prior entered my vision once more, making its way from left to right as it had done before, this time appearing from the pantry. In what I thought was my nightmare, it never came closer than a couple dozen feet. In this episode, it was not 6 feet away from me. It shuffled slowly, and I could see the spine, hands, and feet in more detail than before. They were grotesque in every sense of the word, and if my body had let me, I would have vomited at the sight. I could not follow the creature with my eyes, however, as it made its way from one side of my peripheral vision to the other. It was nowhere to be seen after it had exited my vision, and I could move again. But it was hard to. I was in utter disbelief and I couldn't even bring myself to cry yet. My lip quivered softly and my breath was shallow and irregular. I didn't want to look in any other direction because I was afraid it would appear in some other part of the room. My mother broke the silence when she opened the garage door, groceries in hand. She saw me and immediately asked, "Are you all right?" I couldn't help myself. I broke down into screaming and sobbing. To my mother it probably looked like I had gone insane with hysteria. I refused to describe what happened until well after the incident. From then on I could not be left alone in any setting. Hallways and long stairways were added to my already long list of phobias. It was almost 2 years later when my parents took me to a child psychiatrist with whom I could work with and process my fears. The ultimate aim was to put the monster, which was now a constant thought, to bed. After several sessions, I was able to give it a name and draw it into a picture of something I didn't fear: clowns. I named it Horridge, which was my way of sneaking horror into a name, because he honestly still horrified me. That picture hung on the fridge for years, and Horridge would greet me every day, desensitizing me to his influence. My fear soon became curiosity, which developed into a fascination with the unknown. I now run a paranormal-themed podcast, and on our very first episode, I shared the experience that kick-started my obsession. My childhood monster, Horridge. In 2008 to 2012, I was in my early 20s. I would spend many weekends after a long week at work chilling out with my best friend and my older cousin, doing the typical kinds of things that bored young men do after a hard week at work. Listening to music, jamming together on instruments, as we all played in bands, going out drinking and smoking quite a lot of herb. We would also sometimes combine said activities with another hobby of ours, going on long walks and hanging out in the woodlands and countryside that surround our town, picking a spot and listening to music while sinking beers and smoking joints, talking about whatever. We always considered it a blessing that a 10-minute walk in any direction out of our town would take you out to scenic views of rolling hills and woodlands for miles upon miles, as far as the eye could see. We had one particular spot in the woodland that is on the edge of our town. Our chosen hangout was a stroll just off the woodland track about 5 minutes into the woods, where a bank rolled down to the edge of a stream, nice and secluded so we could smoke and drink without attracting attention to ourselves. It was also very peaceful, so you could hear someone coming from miles away if they were to walk the track nearby. We came here many times and had great hazy weekend evenings together at our little hangout, where we would often stay well into the night before heading back to the track and splitting off to our own homes once we'd reached the roads. One evening, though, this all changed, and we never went anywhere near it once it got dark again. I remember clearly that on this particular evening, we were enjoying each other's company as usual, and while I had put a few beers away, I refrained from smoking. I think I was coming down with a cold and didn't fancy it, so I know that what happened was 100% real and not imagined or amplified in my mind from the effects of the weed. It had started to get dark, and I remember laughing as my cousin had brought a bong with him, and I let him and my best friend get on with taking hits alternately, until at one point my cousin got a bit of a tickler, as we jokingly called it, and was coughing and honking his lungs up from taking a rather large hit. Might I add that the little area we were in was very dark by this point, and we set a few candles up on the surrounding trees and rocks, like we always did, to light our spot up a little. We were all positioned on a log, sitting. That was at the top of the bank of the stream, with our backs to the vast expanse of woodland that continued on into the darkness behind us. My cousin is hacking his lungs up, and my best friend and I are now laughing at him, but a little concerned, until he reassured us he was all right, and his coughing fit subsided. As soon as a break in our conversation occurred, my cousin shot a look behind him into the woods suddenly and said, "Shh," very quietly, while staring off behind us. I could see the concerned look on his face as he squinted and watched my best friend Ben follow his gaze and peered into the direction my cousin Aidan was looking. All three of us are now sat in complete silence, turned and staring into the blackness. I whispered to Aidan, "Mate, are you just pranging out a bit? I can't see or hear any..." My sentence was cut off by a loud cracking sound in the direction we were all now facing. I know most people by now who read this are thinking it's a woodland, so sure, there are animals who are making noises, but we all knew this ourselves and were familiar with the wildlife in this area. Something about this had a feeling to it though, like we were being watched. It wasn't a nice feeling at all, and even the occasional sound of a bird in the trees surrounding us had stopped, leaving us in total silence. Aidan stood up slowly and told us to put the candles out, and I could see the humour from earlier in the evening had completely vanished from the look on his and Ben's faces. Ben and I got up slowly without question and put the candles out, leaving us submerged in almost total darkness, except for the moonlight reflecting off of the water in the stream and the occasional beam breaking through the gap in the overhanging trees above us. We gathered our belongings back into our backpacks, and as we returned our view to the direction of the noise we had heard, Ben said he didn't like the feeling he was getting and that we should leave and maybe call it a night. Just as we climbed back up the bank and turned left to head back out to the track, another cracking noise cut through the night. Then another. But this time it sounded like it had come toward us a good few meters, and I could tell by this point from the volume of the sound that whatever it was quite heavy. We are now all walking single file, looking to our right into the pitch black of the woods where the sound had come from. One of us said, "What the fuck is that?" in a desperate but whispered tone, and my cousin snapped a branch off a nearby tree and threw it full pelt into the direction of the sound. Big fucking mistake. Something was clearly disturbed and came at us, heavily bashing the brush and low-hanging branches in its path as it increased its speed towards us. At this point we all near enough shit ourselves, and without saying a word began running as fast as possible for the exit back onto the track, out of the woods, which was around 100 meters or so away, tripping and stumbling due to our poor vision in the darkness. At one point I remember I was running, and whatever the fuck this thing was running diagonally towards us, just beyond my vision to my rear right, and I could see and hear the trees and thicket being trampled by whatever it was. Then the most terrifying thing happened. This thing made this noise that sounded like it revved up from a screech to a loud deep roar that was deafening, causing us all to scream in terror. I remember the noise made all the hairs on my body stand on end, and my vision tunneled into an absolute focus on the hole in the bushes that led back to the track. My legs went into hyperspace and I covered the remaining distance and leapt out of the hole onto the track behind Aidan and Ben, who had already turned to face me as I almost piled into them. I turned to look from where we had just come, and we all stared, gasping for breath, back into the woods. There was nothing. No sounds, and nothing emerged from the hole in the bushes. Dead silence. After a minute or so we continued back to the road, looking behind us every few feet, paranoid out of our minds that whatever that thing was might reappear and come up behind us. We got to the road and stood under a streetlight. "Fuck me, man, what was that?" Ben said, eyes wide with a questioning look of utter horror. We all confirmed that we had no idea what the fuck this thing was, and that while none of us saw it directly, it was too big to be any of the animals we knew to live in the woods. Not a badger, a fox, or even a stag, but it definitely was not a person, because the sound it made was unlike anything a human could produce. We had heard foxes crying and stags and deer before, many times, especially during rutting season. This was definitely not any of those, no way. We had so many questions. Why was it stalking us? Why did it charge at us? When most animals would see 3 men all over 6 feet tall and decide its odds weren't really in its favour if it chose to attack for some reason. None of it made sense, but we all knew that it 100% happened and terrified us enough to feel our lives were truly threatened. We told our parents when we got home, and while many of them grew up in the same area and played in those woods as kids during the 60s and 70s, they all said the only odd thing that they had ever heard of happening in there as kids was they were warned not to stay in the woods after dark, as the petticoat man would get them. This turned out to be a slightly fruity individual that would dress in women's clothing and flash those that came through the woods before running off. He was eventually either arrested or someone's dad kicked his head in, depending on who you asked. Ben never came back to the woods with Aidan and I again, insisting we could just hang out somewhere more open and well lit, and rightly so. Aidan and I returned to the woods one last time during the following week around 3 p.m, and it being summer, the woods were well lit by the baking sun. We spent half an hour or so playing detective, but couldn't work out what the thing had been. We found a few crushed plants where it had run towards the track, but it wasn't conclusive enough to determine this thing had been the cause. The reason Aidan and I stopped going back at all was that during sharing a joint, Aidan looked at me and smiled and said, "Don't be obvious about it, but look behind me at the edge of the wood." And there, stood half hidden behind a tree, clearly watching us, was a man. It creeped me out a bit until I remembered that we were not small lads, and this guy wouldn't stand a chance taking both of us on, especially now we'd seen him. He just stood there, and I made deliberate eye contact with him and he didn't move. Aidan turned to face him and said, "What are you doing over there, mate?" And I followed it by shouting, "Oi, you fucking weirdo, we can see you." At which point he stood out from the tree, froze for a second, and then ran out of the woods. I don't think the two incidents were related in any way, but we never went back there after that. Thanks for reading, and apologies if it sounded like some pro-drugs drinking story. I'd never condone either to anyone else. This was just a time of our lives as young men that we indulged in those kinds of things. I'd also like to state that while I was drinking on the night of the bizarre, horrifying thing chasing us, I was definitely not drunk and was fully conscious of what was happening. We're all older now, and I no longer see Ben or Aidan. People have kids, and fallings out, and life has occurred. I do wonder if it still bothers them, if they even remember it. The man attempting to hide and watch us was creepy, but the thing in the woods that came at us making that fucking awful sound still gives me goosebumps to this day. I was a female 14-year-old girl at the time, and I had a friend that was older than me. He was 24. I considered him to be a protective, loving person that I could look up to. We'll call him Felix for privacy's sake. He was a close friend to the family as well, so I had no reason to worry. We would play video games, read magazines, and watch anime together. I even took him undergarment shopping with me, until one day he started acting a little off whenever I asked him to come somewhere with me. He'd avoid eye contact or avoid giving me a hug, and would even avoid eating at the same table as me. He couldn't bear being in the same room with me. I confronted him about it, but he denied it like it didn't even happen. I shrugged it off as nothing to worry about, since he wasn't drinking or smoking or having trouble with his personal life as far as I knew, until about a few days later. As usual, me and a few siblings and his friends went to his house for a hangout. We called it video games night, and no one drank alcohol since some of us were underaged. It came to the end of the night and everyone starts heading out, and when I gave my parents a call to ask them to come pick me up, they said I should stay where I was for the night because something had happened at the house. I don't recall exactly what it was right now. I told Felix and he didn't mind, but I saw how uncomfortable he was about it. I slept in his room with him since he had a king-size bed, and I hated being alone in his house as it's a little spooky. It was a 2-story house, pretty huge for only one person, but whatever. He gave me a t-shirt of his and boxers that fit me like a pair of shorts to sleep in, and I went up to bed ahead of him. I woke up a few hours later to find him in the living room playing video games. I got up and sat on his lap, facing him. He asked me to get off, but I told him I'd had a bad dream, and that I want to know why he's been avoiding me. He tried changing the subject, but I was stubborn enough to get something out of him. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a while and stood up with me in his arms, heading to the bathroom. I was really confused and asked, "Why are we going there? Put me down, I don't want to watch you pee or anything." Felix giggled and shushed me all the way there. Of course I didn't shut up, so he shoved my face into his shirt. We get there and he sits me on the edge of the bathroom sink, puts his hands over mine on the sides of the sink and says, "The reason why I avoided you is because you look too delicious to me, and I want to do things I shouldn't as you'll cry and scream." I didn't understand what he meant by it, as I was a little childish too, so in response I laughed. "Are you drunk?" As soon as I said that, I raised my head a little to laugh, and it was probably getting him mad for not taking him seriously. He bit my shoulder and kissed it. I felt a little bit of pain, but didn't feel threatened in any way. Even though he was gentle, it still hurt. I tried to push him off, and he pulled both my arms back and held me by the wrists. He then tied them to the sink handle and lifted my shirt a little. He started kissing my tummy and rubbing my thighs, pulling my legs over his arms. I was so scared at the same time to even yell or resist. The only thing I could do was helplessly cry silently and try to kick him and scream, which obviously didn't do anything. Felix was 6'11" and muscular, and my ass was still a 5'6" marshmallow softie. No one was around either to hear me. He kept kissing me all over, my neck, my ears, and for some reason I wasn't mad but sad, because he'd avoided me for such a reason and is showing it in the way that he was. I didn't resist him at this point, as I was paralyzed with fear, sadness and anger. I couldn't help but cry out his nickname that I used whenever I needed his help, protection and comfort. Felix stops suddenly, unties my wrists, picks me up and takes me to the bedroom, apologizing all the way. He hands me a shotgun and points it at his chest as he kneels down on his knees, slightly pressing over my fingers on the trigger. I snap at him, punching his chest, yelling at him about how stupid he is. I feel a weird liquid dripping over me as I hug him and hear a loud glass shattering somewhere behind me. I raise my head towards Felix, only to find myself in the arms of a jet black dark figure with something dripping out of its mouth on me. The glass behind me that shattered was an hourglass that had timed out. I turned my head, not understanding what the fuck is happening, and I feel a stinging pain in my face when I fainted. I woke up in a hospital room the next morning with doctors telling me I had been in a coma for a few months and no one has any memory of someone called Felix. Was I dreaming this entire time? I cry out Felix's name, but no one knows who I'm talking about. I wanted to be with him so badly that I almost knocked myself back into that damn coma, screaming at everyone, telling them everything, yet no one recalls any of my memories of Felix. I'm still in shock and still believe he existed. I'm still terrified of that black figure and wondering what could have happened. I'll always keep you in my heart and look for you. I'm 18 years old now, yet still think to myself, if all of that was a dream, which one is my reality and which one is the dream?